Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. So we have two speakers coming up. I'm going to introduce them both in turn. First, we have Madison Margolin. She's the co-founder and managing editor of DoubleBlind, a biannual print magazine and digital media company at the forefront of the rapidly growing psychedelic movement. Also a Los Angeles and New York-based journalist, Margolin covers psychedelics, cannabis, drug policy, and spirituality. She's written for Playboy Magazine, Rolling Stone, Nylon, Vice, LA Weekly, High Times, Tablet, and others. She's a graduate of Columbia Journalism School and UC Berkeley. Margolin has traveled everywhere from pot farms in the Emerald Triangle to the shores of the Ganges River and all over Israel-Palestine, exploring the role of plant medicine in religion, mental health, and conflict resolution. She got her start in journalism with a column on cannabis at the Village Voice after having lived in South Tel Aviv working with Eritrean refugees. So that's our first speaker. The second one is Shelby Hartman, who is the other co-founder and editor-in-chief of DoubleBlind. She is a reporter and editor specializing in psychedelics, cannabis, drug policy, and mental health. Her work has appeared in Vice, Quartz, The Huffington Post, and Rolling Stone, among others. Hartman worked in broadcast news productions for CBS News, covering presidential elections, protests, natural disasters, and other breaking news. Spurred by a passion for print and investigative reporting, she transitioned to magazine writing, working as an editor at Pasadena Magazine and receiving her master's degree in long-form journalism from Columbia University in 2015. Since Hartman has worked as a columnist in LA Weekly and an editor at Herb, the largest cannabis media company with extensive features on the cannabis industry, the psychedelic research boom, the popularization of ayahuasca, and post-traumatic stress disorder in the veteran community. Thank you, Madison and Shelby. We're really excited to have you both on. Welcome to Psyched.
Shelby. So we're going to be presenting on psychedelics in the media. Just waiting for Shelby to also get her video started here. All right, great.
Eureka! I was promoted to a panelist. How exciting. Hi, everybody. Let me just share my screen quickly. It's nice to be with all of you today. That was very informative chat, Christian. It was great to hear you share. Okay. As mentioned, Madison and I are journalists by trade covering the psychedelic movement. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the relationship between journalism and mainstream media and the way that the psychedelic movement is perceived among the American public and sort of the global public. We have sort of identified three main pillars within the media that shape and cover the psychedelic movement. The first is sort of these publications that are started by people who are deep within the movement and might not be known as well among the American public, but are really covering the psychedelic movement with a great degree of nuance.
The second type of psychedelic media we're seeing are coming out of digital first, often millennial run publications like Vice, Rolling Stone, etc. And they're using a combination of firsthand experience with psychedelics, such as this headline from Vice, "I ate psychedelic mushrooms to treat my postpartum depression," as well as legitimate investigative reporting techniques you see with Rolling Stone, for example, what psychedelics really do to your brain. And again, the main thing here is that they're covering psychedelics with a little bit of nuance, not necessarily as deep as the psychedelic first publications such as Chacruna or Symposia, because they're talking to a mainstream audience, but they're also getting shared much more widely.
And then the third category are sort of these mainstream outlets, many of which have been around for certainly decades, but a lot of these legacy newspapers like the Washington Post and the Atlantic have been around since, you know, the late 1800s, early 1900s. And these are sort of the gold standard publications that publicists always are trying to pitch and trying to get their stories into. And I think that as people who are invested in the psychedelic movement and want it to gain visibility and traction among a general audience, it's really important to understand how these newsrooms operate and why it is that they are not covering the psychedelic movement that often, or when they do, they're not necessarily covering it with the same degree of nuance that we would like to see them do that. So in the case of these digital first millennial run publications that Madison referenced, like Vice and Rolling Stone and Vox and Vocative and Playboy, a lot of these places have basically an army of freelance reporters, many of whom have personal relationships with psychedelics and are following the movement intimately and are pitching their editors, versus at a lot of these more mainstream outlets, a good majority of the content that they're publishing is coming from people inside of the newsroom. And so unless there is someone inside the newsroom like a Michael Pollan who has taken a personal interest in psychedelics and is coming to their editor and saying, hey, this really cool thing is happening called psychedelics, then it's not necessarily landing on the editor's desk, because they're covering so many other kinds of things, right? Like all the other things happening in the world between business and sports and foreign policy. So you really only will see psychedelics appear in these types of publications if sort of like something breaking happens or really significant, like Johns Hopkins opening a multi-million-dollar research center or the county of Denver decriminalizing psilocybin.
So what is media? Next slide, Shelby. So this is media, a meme, basically the idea that how you're representing an idea to the masses, or how you're sharing it and framing it. Shelby, next slide. Again, a means of communication that carries a broad influence. And again, media, even in journalism, does have an element of bias. What we're choosing to cover, who we're choosing to interview, of course, is going to influence the way the audience sees the psychedelic movement, the diversity of the voices who are involved. Next slide, Shelby. Okay, so you could say that quote unquote modern psychedelic media started in the 50s and 60s. So you had books like The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. You had this very famous Life magazine article about mycologist R. Gordon Wasson's first mushroom trip. At this point, the media was open and curious about psychedelics. Next slide. We're seeing headlines like LSD and the mind drugs, LSD art. Again, there wasn't so much judgment as there was an interest in what these drugs were and what they were about and what they had the potential to offer. Next slide. Of course, things politically got a little bit more escalated. Once Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, or AKA Ram Dass, had been expelled from Harvard, Leary went off to do his own thing in California, kind of starting the psychedelic revolution. And at one point was considered the, quote, most dangerous man in America by Richard Nixon. You have this headline here, the exploding threat of the mind drug that got out of control, which was LSD. And so the idea that psychedelics were once this sort of curious thing that people were wanted to know more about and could be a tool in therapy was now being painted as these drugs that were going to make you lose your mind and were seen as threatening and menacing to society. Next slide. In response to that, as the mainstream media really started to turn against psychedelics, we needed to have alternative media that was going to cover drug culture in a way that was a little bit more fair and open. Of course, High Times, you could say, is a biased publication, but point being is they weren't demonizing psychedelics. So it's the sort of the counterpoint to the drug war. So Nixon launched the drug war officially in 1971 when everything from cannabis to LSD were placed on Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act. And then 3 years later, 1974, we have the first issue of High Times. And again, today we know High Times is sort of a cannabis first publication, but initially it was sort of all drugs. In the 70s, it was psychedelics. They covered cocaine and such in the 80s, et cetera. 90s, again, is when sort of the cannabis culture of High Times began to be more apparent. And so today we're having a renaissance both in psychedelic science and in psychedelic media. So a couple of years ago, now 4 years ago, The New Yorker published The Trip Treatment by Michael Pollan, which was a deep investigative piece about the research that's happening with psychedelic science right now. And then about a year later, Ariel Levy published a story about ayahuasca, the drug of choice for the age of kale. And the main difference here we're seeing is that psychedelics are not being treated as drugs that are going to make you lose your mind, but as medicines that are here to help you get well. Especially now during turbulent times, we're seeing more and more the conversation is how can psychedelics help us feel better, deal with our trauma, our addiction, our PTSD, depression, loneliness, etc. Next slide.
Mm-hmm. So as people who care deeply about the psychedelic movement and how we might be able to use media to destigmatize psychedelic plants and bring visibility to a lot of the rigorous research that's being done all over, it's really important to understand the state of journalism in general today and what it is that we're up against. So we all know that the journalism has been in a state of crisis for at least a decade now, as magazines and newspapers have had to rely on digital revenue to fund their content. And what that means is that publications are more focused on the number of people who click on a piece than what's actually in it. And additionally, we know that unfortunately in this day and age of social media and Instagram and all these other things, that readers really don't have very long attention spans. And so, it's actually really sad to see how often readers come to an article and I don't even know what they do on the article because they're there for less than 30 seconds and then they forget about it and they click out of it. Additionally, we know that video is really the most impactful platform, and that it's really important that articles are, if you want them to go far on social media, that there's some kind of shareable video component there. And then the last thing is that, humans really love recognizable names, celebrities, and they really love conflict. And that sort of encourages journalists and editors to be sensationalistic in the way that they talk about things. And all of this deeply affects the way that mainstream outlets are talking about psychedelics.
So in talking about psychedelics, especially in mainstream outlets, it's important that the headlines are accurate. So we have these two headlines here. FDA agrees to new trials for ecstasy as relief for PTSD patients. Of course, maybe the mainstream recognizes ecstasy as a term rather than MDMA. However, ecstasy is often contains maybe adulterants that pure MDMA doesn't. And the point here is that people who are in clinical trials receiving pure MDMA for PTSD are doing so according to very specific protocols, again, with a very pure drug. And there's a fear that if someone were to just take ecstasy at a rave or at a party and expect the same results, that I wouldn't want a headline to miscommunicate that everyone can receive the same relief as the people who are in these clinical trials. Again, the next headline, magic mushrooms as medicine, Johns Hopkins scientists launch Center for Psychedelic Research. it's not really magic mushrooms that they're studying at Hopkins. It's pure psilocybin. That's not to say that you can't have an incredibly therapeutic experience with magic mushrooms on your own in the forest or with friends or wherever. But the results of the research that's happening at Hopkins are coming from psilocybin with a very specific protocol and assisted psychotherapy. So we really want, as the conversation about psychedelics in medicine becomes more mainstream, we want to make sure that the mainstream audience recognizes what specifically we're talking about, and the specificity also of the environment, the set and setting in which the patients are having these positive results.
So just some sort of like high level tips for folks who are in the room. In our opinion, there's sort of two major groups of people who are sort of the gateways to newsrooms and to ensuring that the psychedelic movement gets covered in a way that's nuanced and also accessible. So the first, of course, is journalists who are within the psychedelic movement, who are trying to pitch newsrooms. And then the second is publicists. And, you know, of course, all major organizations, whether it's, you know, MAPS or MindMed or all the major players in the space, I'm sure have publicists who are pitching newsrooms in the hopes of getting their work covered. And so the first thing I'll say is make sure you're pitching the right person. I can't tell you how often people pitch, they just, you know, they'll pitch hello at, for example, hello at newyorktimes.com. Never pitch hello at newyorktimes.com because that email is probably not getting opened. Secondly, I know it seems really basic, but you always want to make sure that you are writing a subject line in the way that a headline would be written, right? Like you want people to read that subject line and to immediately go, oh, that's interesting. So you don't want to use sort of insider baseball language about, you know, business stocks or you know, if you're a researcher and it's science language, really sort of in the weeds language. You want to make sure that it's accessible and it's something that someone who's not in the movement is going to read and understand and think is interesting. Thirdly, you want to make sure that you are always addressing why this story should be told today, not yesterday and not tomorrow. So let's say that you are talking about, you know, you're coming out with a book on the history of LSD. Perhaps you want to wait until Bicycle Day, right? Because that's a timely hook tied into an anniversary. Or perhaps you are talking about, you know, you're doing some work around helping veterans get to the Amazon to drink ayahuasca for their post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, maybe the CDC just came out with a report on, you know, the number of people in the United States, the number of veterans who currently have post-traumatic stress disorder, tie it into that report. I'm not going to go through all of these things, but let's see. For sure, this is a big one for people who are watching. I can't tell you, we get pitched all the time at DoubleBlind about happenings within the psychedelic movement. And when we ask for images from a publicist, what we get is like a researcher standing on a podium, or like a pretty stocky looking, like portrait of the CEO of the company. And I can tell you that you're much more likely to get covered and also to make the journalist happy if you send them editorial images that are actually interesting and actually say something about the work that you're doing. Obviously, social media is everything in 2020. It's unfortunate, but that's just the world that we're living in. And so make sure that you're just doing very basic research on, you know, when are your highest engagement times for the people in your audience. Make sure that make sure that you are engaging with your audience consistently. Make sure that all of your images are really compelling. Make sure you understand the difference between like what succeeds on Facebook versus what succeeds on Twitter versus what's going to succeed on Instagram, because all these platforms function differently. And then lastly, you know, if you are pitching sort of an abstract concept like a clinical trial investigating a synthetic compound of a psychedelic drug, try to find a character, an actual person who you can attach their personal narrative to kind of like this abstract report or abstract press release, because it's always so much more compelling rather than saying, hey, we just found out that, so-and-so synthetic compound is, an effective drug for treating, an eating disorder. Instead, it's be significantly more compelling if you could get a subject who was in that trial to open up about their own experience within the trial. I know there's like issues around confidentiality there, but there are ways around that.
Okay, so tips for sources, that is people who are being interviewed for stories. Number one, if a reporter reaches out to you and you don't know who they are, check out their bylines, Google them, see who else they've written for, read their work, and make sure that you're comfortable working with them. Number two, understand their limitations. So even when you do a whole interview with a reporter, they are subject to their editor's critiques. Half of that interview just might get thrown out. The editor might cut some quotes. They can do their best to relay the information that you gave them, but just understand that they're not always in charge of the final product or the framing of the story. On record versus on background, and versus off record. So this is probably the most important part of this slide. So on record, anything you say can be used in the story. Your words can be published. On background means your words will not be published. However, maybe that the reporter can take that information and corroborate it with somebody else. So if you say on background, I didn't tell you, but look into whether XYZ happened and go ask this person instead of me. I don't want to be the one who said it. Off record means do not ever repeat this. So again, when you're talking to a reporter, make sure that it's clear between the two of you which information is on record, off record, on background. Number four, know your rights. A reporter doesn't have to show you the entire story before it gets published, but you are able to ask them to show you the quotations that they're hoping to use in the story, and the context in which they're going to use those quotes, so you know that what you've told them is going to be represented accurately. Prepare sound bites. Sometimes reporters will send you questions ahead of time so you can prepare. It's also okay to ask the reporter, what's the story on? What should I prepare in advance of the interview? Have information ready so that as you're talking, you can have quotes that you really want to get across rather than sort of fumbling over your words. Again, also, reporters, not every reporter will record the interview. You can request that they do. For me, it depends really on the sensitivity of the interview. Sometimes I will verbatim type out what the resource is telling me. Other times I'll record. So it really depends on the length and what the interview is about and whether we're going to do a quote check. Number six, send relevant materials, especially if you're a scientist or have published other work before. It's always really helpful to send published studies or published articles or other articles in which your name has been mentioned. And number seven, they can't represent your perspective if you don't share it with them. So oftentimes I will reach out to somebody and they'll just say they're too busy to talk to me, which I totally understand. However, if the story is going to be written anyways, and it's going to be pertaining to something that you're working on, it's always better to make sure that your opinion is represented, especially if it is a sensitive topic. So just keep that in mind, that the story will go on whether or not you agree to an interview. And so it's always best to really share your opinion if you have the time, because we really value it, and that is what makes the story. Next slide.
Not that scary. Just want to acknowledge Marique and the other folks at PsychEd that we're coming up against our time, so won't be offended at all if you just hop in and cut us off, but we're going to keep going. We have another 5 minutes. So how will journalism shape the psychedelic movement? What we choose to cover, who we interview, who we hire, and fueling conflict versus bridging divides. So anyone who is in this room, regardless of whether you are an investor or a scientist or a publicist or just a passionate psychonaut, probably know that we're in a very funny time in psychedelic history. There are many models that are being put forth for overturning psychedelic prohibition, whether that's the decriminalization of all entheogenic plants and fungi, just the decriminalization of psilocybin. Some people believe that we should only be going sort of the FDA approval, double-blind randomized clinical trial route. Other people believe there's space for many different kinds of models. That's just to say that, as mentioned before, that there is this unfortunate sort of emphasis on sensationalism in some newsrooms, because conflict can be very sexy and it gets a lot of clicks from readers. But we deeply feel at DoubleBlind like the media plays an integral role in how dialogue unfolds among the American public, and that it is our responsibility, as well as the responsibility of everyone in the psychedelic movement, to ensure that we are coming together and we are speaking with one another openly about our perspectives and what our goals are. And we feel that journalism and intentional storytelling can play a really integral role in ensuring that the various stakeholders in the psychedelic movement are communicating with one another. And then also, you know, we're really deeply committed, and we think that it's important that journalists across newsrooms are committed to covering many different things within the psychedelic movement. So we all know that that MAPS has done incredible work getting MDMA through the FDA approval process, and that psilocybin is also fast-tracked by the FDA for treatment-resistant depression as well as major depressive disorder. Huge wins for the psychedelic movement, but there is so much more happening within the psychedelic movement, particularly really important work happening among nonprofits and doing work around peyote conservation and uplifting indigenous communities in the Amazon who are fighting foreign oil and mining extraction. So there's a lot of groups that may not have the resources to, you know, hire a publicist, or may not have the savvy necessarily to grow a massive social media following, but who also play a really important role in ensuring that we're not creating a hierarchy in which taking psychedelics in a particular kind of way is considered more legitimate than taking it in another kind of way. Everyone needs to be heard. Everyone needs to be at the table.
So how can psychedelic values shape the future of journalism? Again, if you're a beat reporter, you're probably not completely objective. Just the nature of covering the same topic day in and day out, you're naturally going to develop opinions on it. So acknowledging that, you know, people often talk about the psychedelic value of oneness. It's actually a criteria for what's called the mystical experience that psychedelic scientists have identified, you know, with the use of psilocybin and so forth. So how can this oneness sort of help us create more connection to other topics in the world around us? So at DoubleBlind, we say that we're using psychedelics as a jumping off point to talk about mental health, spirituality, environmental justice, social equity, and so forth. And so we're really talking about one conversation that includes psychedelics as a means to sort of embed all of these other aspects of society. So again, you can't look at a certain industry without asking about the healing modalities, medicines, etc. So yeah, that's what's next in psychedelic journalism.
And then lastly, just sort of building on what was said before, we do feel that this is a really important time in psychedelic history. We do feel that all of the various media outlets within the space, all the various media outlets in general should be coming together, particularly when there's so much to cover, to support one another, rather than to sort of all put out the same story and compete and try to get it first and try to get it better and try to get more clicks. There's so much to cover. And Madison and I feel that that taking the lessons that we have learned through our own plant medicine and psychedelic journeys and applying them to the journalism industry, that will lead to a more sort of cooperative ethos between all the various stakeholders. And so we always like to end our talks by saying, like, whoever you are, whatever you're thinking, whatever you're working on, like, we invite you to reach out to us. We really are deeply invested in seeing this movement unfold in an equitable way in which the most number of people can access these plants for healing. And feel free to reach out. There's our email.
Thanks, guys, so much. I really appreciate it. Taught me a lot. I think that, you know, media is something that we're trying to learn about a lot today as well, especially with psyched. I had a couple questions, but the main one being really about collaboration in the media space. Something that I've never really seen is, you know, having a joint article with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and Vice, let's say. I guess I'd love to know, like, why doesn't that happen? And is that something that we should be thinking about creating for the future of media in this space?
So a joint article gets a little complicated with SEO value. It is a very technical thing. Can you have the same story appearing on two sites without diminishing its SEO value? So that is part of it, and something that editors often consider. But Shelby and I have written, for instance, we've co-published with Quartz, where we gave them one of the stories that I wrote, and for their site, and we published it later on. I think even a few months later. We also wrote something for Playboy that, you know, said, I think in our bio we said, you know, we're DoubleBlind co-founders. So we definitely have relationships with other publications, and it's something that we're looking more into developing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll also say that, you know, I was always really disheartened by this. I started out my career at CBS News, so I'm very familiar with how it is that mainstream newsrooms find their news, and pretty much what it is we call it the Associated Press or Reuters pipeline, where you have these wires that are covering, you know, sort of like they have freelancers and stringers all over the world, and there's like a select few stories that the broadcast news networks pick up on, and they all sort of amplify each other and just talk about the same thing like over and over and over again. I think that part of that is that that audience members really get invested in a particular story. And of course, if something's very timely, like, you know, coronavirus or the protests, it makes sense for everyone to be talking about it. But a lot of times they'll pick one story, and because they know that readers sort of like to get invested in seeing how that unfolds and seeing like the dialogue between the various outlets and how they're all covering it. Our opinion is, like, my personal opinion is, that's kind of a waste of resources. There's too much going on in the world for everyone to be talking about the exact same thing, unless it's like very important.
Definitely. The last question that I have is, you know, you both talked a lot about just being able to really hold a lot of ethics and kind of values aligned journalism throughout all of this, making sure that, you know, you're not just capitalizing on the most clickbait worthy story. What begins to happen when, you know, outlets that are maybe less informed about the psychedelics ecosystem, that do have major audiences, begin reporting in that way, possibly as psychedelics become more mainstream, and you know, begin to market that media to demographics in our society, which might not be as eager to read stories from more open-minded media publications. What happens then?
Hopefully we push the conversation forward the way that Michael Pollan did with How to Change Your Mind. I mean, we really, in our society, we have a deep reverence for science. So I think that, you know, if we're able to cite rigorous data, then it can't be refuted. I also think, as said before, that it's really important to have a character that people can relate to. So particularly in conservative states, there's obviously a lot of empathy for our veterans. they often said that really the perception of cannabis started to change when you realized that your brother needed it to sleep, or that your, mom needed it for her arthritis. And I think that, that's what we're going to see. We're going to really need to be intentional about the stories that we choose and what characters that we choose, and sort of hopefully our prose is compelling enough for people to understand the profound impact of these things.
Definitely. Yeah, well, thank you both so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you around the conference, and I'm sure we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. All right, so throughout the sponsorship period, we've decided to do something a little bit different